I'm Catherine Kingsley.
And I'm Catherine Stern.
And this is
Contemplating Culture,
a missionary walk through a secular age. Together we journey through A Secular Age by Charles Taylor, a book looking at the history and philosophy of how the world got where it is, and the impacts of our contemporary culture for us today as missionaries.
And we're inviting you to join the conversation.
Hello and welcome back to Contemplating Culture.
Hello, everyone.
So we've been on a bit of a journey. Chapter 1, the introduction, they took us a long time. Chapter 2 took us a little bit less. Today will probably be, maybe the only time we do an entire chapter in a single podcast, because this chapter is quite short. It's only 12, 13 pages. So today is called The Great Disembedding, and we're hoping to tackle the whole thing in one go.
That's really exciting. Does that mean we can say we're 3 chapters in at the end of this podcast?
It's really for productivity purposes.
Absolutely. 3 chapters, and what's that, like a third of the book if we're lucky? Probably not even that. Less than a quarter of the book, looking at the pages you've got written
so
there.
158 will be up to after today of 800 or something like that.
Yeah.
But it's good, and I'm really thinking about a lot of the things that we talk about after we've talked about them. Like, it just keeps chewing. So if for no one else, I'm really glad that at least for us, we're getting to mull these things over and discuss them, and hopefully it's helpful for people listening as well.
Absolutely. And hopefully it's impacting not just on our thoughts, but the way that we're working and evangelizing.
So as I said, today's chapter is called The Great Disembedding. So that could mean anything, but he's got a very particular kind of thing that he's talking about. And it's, I guess, the connection that society and religion have, that there's kind of a oneness between them. And today he's going to talk about kind of 3, if maybe that's a boat, like the boat's anchored to shore, but the boat's going to go off and have a little cruise. So there's 3 little anchoring points, 3 little moorings that are holding it together. And so Taylor's going to talk us through some of the ways that this kind of thing of society and religion start to separate. So I've called today Migration from a People to a Society of Individuals.
So like moving from thinking of myself as part of a greater we, and a we who think together, believe together, worship together, which means evangelization's easy because all I need to do is pretty much evangelize a king and then his whole people get baptized with him. Whereas today, what we have is a collection of I's who make up their individual minds about things, and you have to re-evangelize every generation. Every individual has their own need to hear the gospel.
That's it. That is what we're talking about of this. Like, wouldn't that be easy if you just evangelize the king? But yeah, each individual needs to be evangelized in a society of individuals. You can't just evangelize the people. So yeah, it's, I think, a really important episode. And one of the things about this new world that kind of society is migrating to during this time is that the individual, as society and religion become disembedded, that the individual now can and indeed must have an individual buy-in to society and to religion, because you're not held in one by being part of the other. So there's individual buy-in at each one. And so Taylor says that there's 3 kind of moorings, anchors, that are holding the 2 together. The first one he talks about is social order. So effectively, when this comes undone, it will mean that I can be practicing a religion however I want, and society's not going to break down.
So we're essentially talking this change that's really brought about maybe by the Reformation, this idea that pre-Reformation a king would help put down heresy because it wasn't good for the social order, whereas post-Reformation any peasant could start his own religion in the end, and the king might even support him in that because the freedom of the individual has become more important.
I think the freedom of the individual is kind of the outcome. The real thing at the heart is that it's no longer a threat. I'm no longer threatened. Society is no longer threatened by your freedom.
Yeah.
Before, like exactly as you said, someone had an idea, it needed to be shut down because it was a threat. Someone has a new belief now, it's not a threat, so it can flourish however it needs to. So that's the first one, social order, and how they kind of get disembedded from each other, that I can be, practicing whatever religion I want and society's not threatened by that. So the next kind of anchoring point he talks about is the cosmos. And so this is about time and place, the temporal kind of things. So we know that at one period of time, you could only worship in a certain way with certain things, with certain people, that it was all kind of very much held together. And so the outcome is that now actually you can worship whenever, wherever, with whatever you want. And so Taylor says that these kind of breaks started even in the 1st century BC. And we were saying before, it's kind of like a bit of a cycle, but each time the cycle comes back around, there's a new situation, so it can break off a little bit further. So this thing that might have started with Jesus coming in to the Samaritan woman at the well in John 4 saying, there'll be a time where you don't need to worship on this mountain or in Jerusalem. You can worship on it because worship will be in spirit and truth. It's like that kind of thing that has begun back there then comes back around of like, actually, you don't need to be in a church, or you don't need to be on a Sunday or whatever it is, that a freedom comes about where my personal religion can be separated from what everyone else is doing.
Yeah.
And the third kind of anchoring point that he talks about is human good. And so in a time when society and religion are so closely held together, both are for each other, which means that my religion is about society in a way. So I'm imagining, like the prayer for the harvest or the prayer for the well-being, the health of people, that it's all very much in the temporal kind of realm. There's a shift that happens. And I think one of the things that we would say is, like, we're not saying these shifts are good or bad, but just saying that they happen.
Yeah. So like, again, something a bit like the last shift, you can see the seeds of it in the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation and the likes of Ignatius Loyola, getting people in touch with their personal response to God. And I guess that same worship in spirit and truth that Jesus was talking about, where it's actually about my response to God and I'm praying in worship rather than in need.
Yeah.
Sort of taking away that Santa Claus image maybe that had sat there before, God as the provider of our collective needs, and moving to this place of God as a person that I'm relating to and as the object of my worship.
Yeah. Yeah. And so through all of this, we're left with a change in identity. So Charles Taylor says that there's a dual shift that happens. The first is what happens in me, how I think of myself. So I no longer identify as, say, an Australian or as a Catholic or whatever. I identify as an individual. I identify, as me. So the identification, my primary identification being as an individual, is kind of like a new shift. And I mean, I didn't live back then, so I don't know exactly how strongly people identified as a society for their first step. But I know that for me, individual as my first identity is super strong, super, super strong. And then as an individual, I then decide where else I place my identity. It's not a given where my identity sits. And then he says the second kind of way that identity shifts is in how I view society, that society isn't a pre-constructed thing that I'm part of, but I actually get to choose almost how I view society, that there's lots of different ways that we can think of society, that for some people, they might think of society as one big family. For some people, it might be just an illusion or a construct. For some people, it might be made up of individuals. For some people, it might be the source of their identity still. For some people, it might be escapable. That all of these things are now possible, that individuals can hold each of these different views of society and still kind of be individuals that are part of society.
I was thinking as you were talking, it's a bit like fish in water, that back in the past, they didn't even really think about what society was because society was what they were. It's almost like a fish that thinks the water is part of who they are. They don't think about what is this water. And now we're in this space where the fish knows itself as an individual that is in the water. And, some fish think of the water as the source of life, the thing that keeps them alive, and other fish are like, no, this is the thing that, I don't know, carries my food around, or this is the source of the currents that push me across the world, that they're all thinking about the water, which they're still all part of, as important for different reasons.
Yeah. And so I think like one of the really important things to think about, and it kind of circles back to our very first episode, was called Where We Think We Are Matters. I think that we're a little bit back there in terms of how we think society is, how we think this group of people, that is the human population, is going to impact how we interact with it. It's going to affect how we interact with the people that make it up. And that's obviously pretty important for us as missionaries and evangelizers. I've heard a lot of priests kind of talk about, you know, St. Peter preached one sermon and 3,000 were converted. You know, I've preached 3,000 sermons and no one was converted. But it's the shifting world that they're kind of part of.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. I was thinking about this retreat that we've got coming up, and I was just doing the dietary sheets and feeling a bit sorry for the chef, thinking, you know, give it 20 years ago and cooking for a retreat meant making a meal and everybody ate it and said thank you. Whereas these days you look at the list and there's 4 vegetarians and there's 3 low FODMAP and 1 gluten-free and 1 dairy-free and 1 lactose-free and 1 allergic to bananas, plus the ordinary people who just eat what they're given. I'm thinking writing out talks for the retreat is a bit like that. I'm talking to a group of people where there's 3 people who actually need a basic evangelization before they're going to take anything of what I'm speaking about in. And there's 4 people who are like so much further on in their journey that they're not going to find a lot of nourishment in the talk pitched at this level. And there's at least 1 person who's going to be triggered by my calling God he. And, you know, you're dealing with this whole bunch of individuals. Even to get people along to the retreat in the first place, I can't just get up after Mass and give a general announcement in a parish. I can't just send out an invitation and CC it to everybody on my email address book. It takes, go back to St. Peter, it takes 3,000 conversations with each of those 3,000 individuals in order to evangelize them. 3,000 conversations to get them to the retreat, 3,000 conversations discipling those individuals who came to the retreat. I can't do a one-size-fits-all anymore.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think Pope Francis, for example, has picked up on this, that a lot of his pastoral kind of message coming out is very much around accompaniment and discipleship. And I think he kind of knows that that's the world that we're in. It's not an option, but I guess it kind of has really big implications for evangelization.
Absolutely. It's a huge need then for evangelizers, for disciples out there. I guess we've moved in this move from a church where you can rely on the priest and the religious or the professional evangelizers, the parish youth minister, the pastoral associate to do all the work, to a church where every Christian needs to be equipped not just as an evangelizer, not just to bring their friends to an event, but then as a discipler to walk with said friends and journey with them in their faith and help them grow. So we've got this massive need to be forming not just evangelists, but disciples for the church.
And that's it, because there's so many man hours, right? Even though a lot of fields are going to maybe lose a lot of their kind of need through AI and things like that, I don't think we're ever going to lose the need for people walking alongside other people. Yeah.
I was talking to a friend of ours the other night who's coming along to help us on our retreat. And in the conversation talking to her, I realized, my calls for people to come help with this retreat, went over her head that I needed to have the individual conversation with her, and nothing could replace that one-to-one connection. Not just, and it would matter, not just anybody could talk to her. It had to be somebody who'd already built that personal connection with her as an individual that she wanted to help. And I think that's the same for evangelization, really, that the first step is building the individual connections in order that you then have the bridge to draw them over.
Yeah. There's so much power in relationship. I remember, even growing up maybe 20 years ago, that even then, like one of my friends that was kind of coming on to youth group was there because of personal invitation. The parish priest had personally said, I think you should do this, right? And then that started her whole journey. So there's so much power in individual accompaniment, individual invitation. But I guess maybe my parents grew up in a different society in some ways, where I know, like I didn't, but I know a lot of that generation had, like a catechism that they learnt or that kind of thing, like that there was a very much a uniformity around how they were evangelized. And I think that there's a frustration then that can emerge if you're still operating out of that mindset. Failure to progress your mindset around what's actually before us, I think leads to frustration in evangelization. I think you'll still get frustration anyway. So I think one of the things that we can do, and I kind of wanted to offer this as the first point for reflection for us moving forward, is how do I conceive of society? Do I conceive of it as something that everyone needs to buy into? Because if I do, I'm going to get really frustrated when I see people escaping society. Do you know what I mean? Like if someone goes off grid or something like that, like buys out of all the expectations of society, I'm going to get quite frustrated. So much I think of our internal frustrations are happening just because of our expectations aren't being met. So I think that would be and I don't even know, to be honest, what I would say my expectations of society are, or how I would put it in a sentence of what I think it is or what I think it should be. But I kind of think that until we can name that, we're going to be operating out of unconscious. And we know a lot of the work that kind of helps us to work is working from the conscious. We want to be conscious of what we're doing so that, that internal stuff isn't pulling us down unnecessarily.
So a good way, as you said, to get in touch with what my unconscious expectations are is to look at, well, what are my frustrations? What am I telling myself when, all my efforts to preach the best are like going nowhere, or to get people to join my alpha team are not getting any responses because all I'm doing is speaking from the front of the church? Like, where's the frustration sitting in me, and what is that frustration telling me I'm expecting? And maybe that then will tell me how I'm looking at the world, what I actually have been thinking society is, or how it works.
Well, that's good. All right, so I'll kick it off as you're talking. Not this is going to be an exhaustive list of my frustrations with society, but something that recently I've noticed myself getting frustrated with is when people decide that what they do doesn't affect other people. Like that's a frustration to me. That's like, how could you not care about the impact of your actions? Like, sure, it's great for you, but actually you're part of a bigger whole. So when people buy out of I'm part of a bigger whole, so that's probably doing exactly what you said. It's probably telling me that somewhere I'm saying society is, I accept that I'm part of the whole and that my actions have implications for people beyond just me or my immediate person that it relates to.
It's true. And it's I've got a similar frustration, I would say, around people who seem to just need to be individual for the sake of it. Like they see what everyone else is doing and immediately choose to do something different, not because they think that what everyone else is doing is wrong, but there's this seeming inner need to be individual, to be different, which then has a cost potentially for everybody else that they're not thinking through, because they're not thinking about like what's the connection, how's this affect everybody. They're thinking about my need to not conform or not be the same as, or to be different. Again, there's something in me that expects that people think about the fact that we're connected, that everything that we do has an implication for somebody else.
Okay, so another one of my frustrations, I think, linked to the first one, but I think would be something around the sense that society is right now and only right now. like when people are making decisions that are going to negatively impact the people that aren't here yet, or that disregard the people that have been there before, if that makes sense. So like, I think for me, that's telling me that I have a sense of society as like an ongoing, like the torch is ongoing and we just get to carry it for a little bit. When someone goes off route with the torch or changes what they use the torch for, it's now a lampstand or something like that. Do you know what I mean? Now a bat or whatever. Like when someone changes what that thing is and what it's for. So I think for me, there's probably something around, I think that society is an ongoing movement of humanity. So my frustration is then when people kind of take that off route of like, I'll disregard tradition and I'll disregard, you know, any future consequences for other generations. What matters is, you know, me getting what I need right now.
I've just been reflecting too that sometimes my frustrations aren't even about society, they're about me. So it's worth tracking that too. Like, you know, they're not always going to lead to what my vision of society is or should be. Like, you know, as an introvert, the frustration of having to have 3,000 conversations in order to get people along to an event is just tiring. And it's frustrating, not because I think society should be a particular way, but the reality of what it's going to cost me, something that I would prefer not to give, is just, I guess, a spin-off of how society really is. And maybe sometimes it's worth naming those frustrations and being able to recognize that it's an inescapable part of ministry today.
And I mean, even just thinking now, I was thinking those 3,000 conversations are probably all happening with the one person. That's probably just to get one person happening. I was thinking, man, I don't know anyone who's won over in a conversation. So it's actually multiplied, isn't it? That, it could be a whole life just accompanying one person, really, because that's sometimes what it takes to bring someone to an openness to receiving what God has for them. So, I guess that's the first encouragement from today, is have a little time thinking about what's frustrating you so that you can get an idea. So I guess for Kat and I now, the work is to go away with, you know, those frustrations and think, well, how is this impacting how I evangelize, and what's the work that I need to do to be a good evangelist, right? Because the mission sits in us. And then I guess the next thing is exactly like Kat and I, our sisters, there's how many, like maybe 20, 21 of us or something like that. We can't have, even if we spent every single minute of our life having conversations, we still wouldn't, you know, cover like 1% of what needs to be done kind of thing. So we really are reliant, I guess, on all people rising up and doing the mission at the moment. I think is a lot about accompaniment and discipleship. So I guess the question is, like, where are you being called into that sphere? And I think there's definitely times and stages of your life when you have more capacity for it, but I'm not sure if the mission really escapes anyone.
Absolutely. I'm also thinking that one of the questions, especially if you're in a position in a church or in the church, one of the things we need to be thinking about is, are we actually equipping people? We're getting better as a church at equipping evangelizers, but are we equipping people to be walking with one another? Because I think that is a glaring need at the moment. We can see that we need more people accompanying other people, but there's very little in terms of programs and here's how to walk with another person and help them grow.
Yeah, it's true. And there's something I think as well about the value, I guess, of community, or of having people to be taking risks with, or like I'm imagining, you know, like a group of young people going out into their workplaces, taking the risk, but then coming back and being able to talk about it and brainstorm and encourage each other and debrief, all that kind of thing. So I think it's harder if you try to do it out on your own as well. So I think the trap is to then be isolated as an individual. But I guess one of the things we want to be offering people is, as you said, that place to come back to get the skills to go out, to get the encouragement to keep going out and to be able to learn, how to do it well.
It's funny that in that society of individuals, there actually is still that greater need of a we, of a need to feel like I belong, but I need to choose it.
Yeah.
So as a church, we are a we. We're reaching out to individuals. We're actually all identifying as individuals as well. But there's something of drawing people into the we, of that individual evangelization, individual discipleship, helping people to feel like this we is a place that I belong, that I'm going to buy into this we.
Yeah, it's funny because I think that's actually part of the work of evangelization, because I'm writing a talk for our upcoming retreat on the Holy Spirit, and one of the things I'm looking at is the purpose of the Spirit's coming, looking at the twofold purpose of building the people of God and, bringing the individual into personal relationship with God, that's the dual purpose. The Spirit's doing both of those, the individual and the communal. And I think maybe we've done a great job on the individual, but we've somehow, I think, more work can be done in evangelizing people into, actually, I'm part of the people of God. The Spirit didn't come, God didn't come so intimate to us so that we would be alone with him, but so that we would be that living stone, that part of the member of the body that actually, it's not just about my being grafted to Jesus and isn't that lovely for us, but actually I'm part of the whole vine. And it's, I wonder maybe if there's something for us to take there of being able to draw people into a sense of the bigger, because it's been detached from them in how they've kind of been evangelized and how they've been brought into society, that in both spheres, the whole is kind of a little bit more foreign. And I think last week we were talking about the near or close realities, experience far, experience close. I think maybe the we is an experience far thing for people. But I was thinking, I've had friends go to massive concerts before, and they say there's this moment where everything just feels like a one, that there's a oneness that they experience. Recently, I went to see the Barbie movie, and I had a 6-year-old with her mum on one side and a dad with his, teenage girls on the other side. And I was thinking, we've all had our individual buy-in to this movie, right? Like, we've all been drawn here by our individual purposes. But there's a moment when you're just sitting, with a communal common experience, and it finishes and you just feel like we did that kind of thing. The other night, I went to the Matildas round of 16 game, and the same kind of thing, right? Everyone's there for their own reason, but there's a oneness about what's happening there. And so I think, maybe part of our work of evangelization is to highlight for people these moments, but also to do whatever we can to help people experience them within the church as well, this oneness, because without that, something's missing.
I was thinking as you were speaking, a really good example of that is something like World Youth Day. Like, people go essentially for their own reasons. You have to invite every individual personally. Then they have their own experience of the whole thing. But there are moments at World Youth Day, which I think we've both experienced. And it's not just World Youth Day, but it's a very recent example. Moments at World Youth Day where there's this hush, and there's hundreds of thousands of people all focused on the Blessed Sacrament. Or, that sense of oneness as church. And it's why you see people come home from World Youth Day with a buy-in to faith, because it's meeting both needs, hopefully. It's meeting that individual need, but also that sense of, oh my goodness, look at this we. Wow, I feel part of the church.
Yeah. So maybe that's the last little point for today, is maybe to just spend a little moment in prayer, just saying, Holy Spirit, as you come to draw me closer to God, help draw me into a sense of the oneness of the people of God as well.
Amen.
This has been Contemplating Culture, a podcast produced by the Missionaries of God's Love Sisters. For more information from today's episode, be sure to check out the show notes. We pray that today has blessed you, and most importantly, we invite you to continue the conversation.